From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power with David Westin.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our television and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. It is an historic day in the United States of America. The Supreme Court did what many thought might be unthinkable, which is they overturned over 50 years of precedent in Roe v. Wade, as well as Casey this morning, with far-reaching implications certainly for individual rights, but also potentially for the economy and for business as well. To start off with the opinion itself, we turn now to our Supreme Court reporter. He is, of course, Greg Stohr in Washington. So, Greg, take us through exactly what happened here.
What happened was basically the draft leaked opinion that we saw a month and a half ago. Justice Sam Alito for the court, for 5 justices, said that Roe versus Wade was egregiously wrong, was not based in the country's history or traditions, and they voted to overturn that ruling. Chief Justice John Roberts joined the court in upholding the law before them, a 15-week ban in Mississippi, but he said he wouldn't have taken that last step.
So, as you know so well, Greg, from your vast experience in the Supreme Court, typically these major decisions are not the last word in it. It actually often foments more litigation. What's the next question coming up? Is there any anticipation what the next challenge will be?
There will be all manner of next questions. The court gave us some clues about some of them. So, for starters, what does this mean for other rights? Justice Alito said it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't affect same-sex marriage. It doesn't affect contraceptive rights. He said abortion is different because we're talking about a potential fetal life here. The dissenters are very skeptical of that. They are worried about where the court will go next. There are also some abortion-related questions that we'll see. One of those is, can a state bar somebody from traveling to another state to have an abortion? There have been proposals to do that. Justice Kavanaugh, in what could be a key concurring opinion, said that in his view, a state cannot do that. And that might be enough to doom those sorts of laws. But there will certainly be many, many other questions that come along.
Okay, we'll be coming back to you on each and every one of them. Thank you so much to Greg Stohr. He is Bloomberg Supreme Court reporter. Now, to get a sense of what's going on actually at the Supreme Court itself, we turn to our Bloomberg Washington correspondent, Joe Matthew. He's the host, of course, of Sound On weekdays on Bloomberg Radio. Joe, thank you so much. You're up at the Supreme Court. Give us a sense of what's going on up there.
It's been quite a rambunctious scene here, David. It started before, in fact, the ruling was even announced. Several hundred people had gathered outside, activists on both sides of this issue, and the crowd has been building ever since. We've been here now for some time, and it looks like a couple of thousand people, in fact, are gathered in front of the Supreme Court. And as you might remember, they erected a large barrier around the Supreme Court, much like we saw around the Capitol following January 6th. As soon as that opinion draft was leaked, the barriers remain, but the police presence here is significant. Capitol Police, D.C. Police, and other agencies have even been bussed in here in some cases in terms of the U.S. Capitol Police to try to keep things under control, and so far they have been. But the people, David, behind me who have gathered in front of this court today represent the front lines of this issue, pro-life and pro-choice. We've heard a lot of yelling. We haven't seen any shoving. We haven't seen any fighting break out, but a lot of signs and a lot of passion here today, David.
Joe, I don't want to extrapolate too much from this, but perhaps just for a moment, you make a very important point. It's not just demonstrating on one side, and that's something we've seen pretty much since Roe versus Wade was first decided. It was a divisive issue then, right, and it remains a very divisive issue today. Although a majority of Americans may be in favor of permitting some form of abortion, it's a substantial plurality who are against it.
That's absolutely right, and they are represented here today as well. You might be seeing and hearing a bit more at the moment from pro-choice activists who have been streaming in here from all directions, David. Right in front of me is the U.S. Capitol, the Supreme Court behind me, and there have been bike racks set up all around this area to try to control crowds, so they're streaming in through some very narrow areas. But we've seen everything from celebration to tears on both sides today as people kind of exercise their emotions and sort of bring the passion here. The question is, what's the president going to say a little bit later, knowing that we heard earlier today that Gallup shows confidence in the U.S. Supreme Court among Americans has fallen to to a more than 50-year low, David.
Yeah, Joe makes such an important point. We do expect to hear from the President of the United States, Joe Biden, at about 12:30 Eastern time. But before that, we're supposed to hear from Kevin McCarthy. He's the House Minority Leader. We'll bring you both of those as they occur. Joe, thank you so much. That's Bloomberg's Joe Matthew. Once again, host of Sound On. You can listen to him tonight at 5 p.m. Eastern time on Bloomberg Radio. And now we want to turn to some of the politics of all this. And for that, we turn to our political contributors. It's Rick Davis of Stone Court Capital and Jeannie Shan Zaino of Iona College. So, Jeannie, I'll start with you. As I said in the open, there was a time that we thought it would be unthinkable this would happen. Well, that has happened.
It has. And, even though we had the draft opinion and most people thought this was coming down the pike, I have to say myself, working through this decision, it is a bit eerie to see it now in black and white. And I am still working through the decision. But, one of the things that's very striking as you look at, for instance, Clarence Thomas's concurrence in this, he does raise questions about some of these issues that Greg was talking about, same-sex marriage, contraception, and the like. He says we weren't asked to decide those today, but, if we were, we'd have to revisit that. Now, they don't have the votes at this point for that, but that is the concern you're hearing, particularly on the left, that this is something of a slippery slope. It was this right today, and in the future with this conservative court, something else could fall. And I think we're going to hear more of that as we move into the midterm and the 24 election.
And Rick, let's pick up on that. If we look at the more right of center part of the country, if I can put it that way, are they going to say we should be careful about going further? Or in fact, is this just going to be a bit in their teeth as a practical matter in some of these, particularly state legislatures that are controlled by Republicans?
Well, these state legislators, as you mentioned, have been legislating on these things for quite some time, right? They're passing trigger laws in advance of a decision like this around Roe. They're putting limitations on abortion access all the time. They are litigating cultural war issues like gay marriage and other issues all the time. So this is actually the normal course. What this does is give them a shot in the arm that they can actually legislate in these areas and actually know that they're not going to be found unconstitutional when it gets to the Supreme Court.
Rick, not to put too fine a point on it, does this mean anything for the midterms, do you think?
Sure. I think that it's all about intensity. Who's going to show up in November of 2022? And I think that there could be an argument either way, right? I mean, this is a huge plus for the pro-life Republican supporters out there. They're going to want to do a victory lap. They're going to want their people in powerful positions so that nothing can get done in Congress to overturn this. And of course, it's going to electrify the pro-life, pro-choice community because now they have had something taken away, right? And they're on defense, and they're going to be angry, and they're going to want to do something about it. And this ballot box is really the only thing they can do about it within the next 6 months.
Okay, thank you so much. And we're going to be going back to Jeannie Shan Zaino and Rick Davis throughout this 2-hour special coverage of the overturning of Roe versus Wade. Coming up, we're going to talk about today's Supreme Court decision with former head of Planned Parenthood, Gloria Feldt. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. We are having 2 hours of special coverage on Balance of Power today of that overturning of Roe versus Wade. And we should be hearing from the House Minority Leader shortly. He is Kevin McCarthy of California. We'll bring you that when that happens. In the meantime, we want to turn to Gloria Feldt. She's the former CEO of Planned Parenthood and the current president of Take the Lead, a nonprofit dedicated to achieving gender equity. So thank you so much, Gloria, for being with us. Give us a sense of what you think the practical effects will be for women and even more broadly for the workforce of this decision.
Thank you, David. Thank you for having me. The Balance of Power, the name of this program, is exactly the correct framing for this issue, because this decision is not about abortion. It is about power and patriarchal control over women, especially having a negative impact on poor women who can't travel to other states or other countries, and people of color for whom these consequences will fall most harshly. There is no doubt of that, because we've seen that before. Some of us remember before. And so the next steps have to be that literally we start over again, creating a new jurisprudence, a new legislative basis for women's civil and human rights to make their own childbearing decisions. You, I think, mentioned that there is conversation in the opinion, which I haven't read fully yet, but I have been saying for years that if abortion is overturned, then so is the right to contraception. So are LGBTQ rights, including marriage equality and many other rights of that are not explicitly named in the Constitution, but that have been affirmed by prior courts. And so what we need to understand is that all civil rights are under threat. So it's not just women who will suffer, it is women, their families, and also it is an economic issue as well. You know, there is not a woman who is in an executive position right now who could have been there 100 years ago, both because of law, but also because there was no way for women to reliably be able to plan and space their childbearing. Well, now there is. And it is huge. It will have huge implications, economic implications for families and for companies.
Gloria, take us back through history, if you would, a bit. Not that you were there for it. I'm old enough to be. You're not. But one of the things that strikes me is it's 50 years now since Roe versus Wade, and yet the country did not come together behind that decision. Unlike, for example, Brown versus Board of Education. 50 years after Brown versus Board of Education, everybody was pretty agreed it was the right decision. That didn't happen here. Why was that? It still seems to be just as divisive as it was on day one.
I have been here for quite a bit of it, David, and but I will go back even further to 1873 when the first laws were passed outlawing contraception, the Comstock laws. It took 100 years from that time till 1973 when Roe was decided by the United States Supreme Court. So it has been a long trajectory. And the reason it has taken so long and the reason there has been such pushback against it is precisely because the move toward gender equality is because it affects every single one of us. It is the most is the most radical, as it were, movement for social justice in the country and really on the face of the earth. And for women to become first-class citizens, not second-class citizens, the first thing you have to be able to do is to determine whether, when, and with whom to have children, to have authority over your own bodies. So that's why I said at the beginning, understand this issue is not about abortion per se. It is about power and who will wield it, how they will wield it, and over whom.
And Gloria, taking your notion of sort of a battle, a tug of war over gender equity in this country, one of the things the Supreme Court did today, I dare say, was move it more into the political branches, away from the courts. What possible actions could be taken by the political branches to try to address some of the downsides you identify?
Mm-hmm. We don't know yet what this particular court would do if there were federal legislation, but that's the first thing that needs to happen. And when I was president of Planned Parenthood Federation of America, we wrote a piece of legislation that essentially codifies not just Roe, but codifies the right to make our own childbearing decisions, and that's the language of it, without government interference, as a human right, as a civil right. Not just as a gender issue, but literally as a civil and human rights issue. So that is the first thing that needs to happen, not merely protecting clinics, not merely protecting women. Those are very important things to do. But we need to have a core conversation in this country about, is a woman a citizen? Did Abigail Adams, you may recall, asked her husband John when he was writing the Constitution to remember the ladies, and he didn't. He made fun of her, and we're still suffering from that even now. America has not come to grips ever with making women full and equal citizens, and that's where we have to go. That is why I say, you know, the fact that Roe was cleanly overturned might end up giving us that opportunity to have that important conversation and to build an entirely new jurisprudence of reproductive rights.
It's a really terrific perspective to have. Thank you for sharing with us. That's Gloria Feldt, former head of Planned Parenthood. Coming up, more on the Supreme Court's decision. We're going to speak with Minnesota Senator Tina Smith. That's next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. We have 2 hours of special coverage of this decision from the Supreme Court today, overturning Roe against Wade, as well as Casey against Planned Parenthood. And to continue that coverage, we turn now to Senator Tina Smith. She's Democrat of Minnesota. Senator, thank you so much for being with us. To some extent, what the Supreme Court did today was say, you know what, the courts aren't going to have the rules here. We're going to have more of the political entities do it, both state and federal. Give us a sense of what is doable politically in response to this decision.
Well, I think what the court said was very dramatically that 50 years of precedent and the United States Supreme Court don't matter, and that actually we don't believe that the right to abortion, the freedom to make decisions about your own life in this way is guaranteed by the Constitution. And as you say, then what that means is that it pushes it back to state legislatures all across the country. I can't think of another example where the court has said this fundamental freedom is going to be determined based on where you live in this country, which is now the reality that American women are going to be facing. And of course, across the country, there are trigger laws in place. What that means is a law that says as soon as Roe versus Wade is overturned, which it has been as of today, the right to abortion is gone in this state. I think about 26 states, people's right to access to abortion care will be either dramatically reduced or gone altogether. So this is going to create a crisis for women all across the country. And it'll also create a crisis for states where abortion will still be legal as folks try to figure out how to get access to the care that they need so that they have control over their own lives.
Let's talk about the Congress first, where you serve up there. There are people now calling for federal legislation to reinstate the protections of Roe versus Wade. Let's be honest, it might be something you would like, but is there any realistic prospect of that?
No, there isn't. In the United States Senate, as you know, you have to have 60, not 51, but 60 people to go along with any piece of legislation that passes, and we don't have 60 people in the Senate. It's also important to know that the Republican Party and the leader of the Republican Party in the Senate has said that he believes that the idea of a national ban on abortion would be on the table if Republicans were in control of the Senate. So you're right. The debate over abortion and who gets to decide will continue in Congress, even as it gets played out in hundreds of different ways in state legislatures around the country.
When you talk about a possible ban on abortion, and we did hear, I think it was Mitch McConnell talked about it, wasn't it? As a practical matter, does the filibuster rule that has really defeated some efforts from the Democrats turn around the other way, assuming, in fact, they get a majority, but it's not enough to beat the filibuster?
Well, I think that that's true under the rules of the Senate as they stand right now. There would not be, depending on who's in the Senate and all of the ins and outs of our process, I think that that's true. But I think it's really important for people to understand this is a fundamental difference between the two parties in our country. And I think that there's just no doubt that my party is much more aligned with where Americans are. Americans believe that it should be people and not government who decide.
Senator Smith, it was so wonderful to have you with us. Thank you so much. That's Tina Smith from Minnesota. We're going to go now to Capitol Hill, where the Minority Leader, Kevin McCarthy, is speaking.
The people have won a victory. The right to life has been vindicated. The voiceless will finally have a voice. This great nation can now live up to its core principle that all are created equal, not born equal, created equal. Americans celebrate this historic victory because we know it will save the lives of millions of children and it will give families hope. But as encouraging as today's decision is, our work is far from done. Americans remain one of only 7 countries on earth that allow elective abortions in the 3rd trimester. Of those 7 countries that America's one of them, there's 2 others, China and North Korea. That is radical. The House Democrats continue to support it against the wishes of the American people. This Congress, every House Democrat has voted for extreme policies, like taxpayer-funded abortion on demand until the point of birth. But Democrats' radical agenda does not have America's support. To the contrary, America rejects it because they remain committed to our values and our principles. The Supreme Court was not bullied by the far-left mob. Threats of violence against the justices did not win. And the truth is, pro-life Americans are not planning a night of rage. The reaction to this principled decision by the court, it must be peaceful. And the DOJ must step up to protect our justices, their families, churches, and pro-life pregnancy centers from unprovoked violence. To the DOJ, do not be silent. Do not stand back and uphold the rule of law. We live in a country that is based on the dignity of all human life. With that, we'll take some questions. Yes, ma'am.
Leader McCarthy, Justice Thomas, as part of this ruling, has said that he wants to revisit things like the Supreme Court's decision on gay marriage and contraception. What do you all say to that?
Well, the Supreme Court is a different branch of government. They can look at whatever comes before them. I just know in what we are doing and what we have today is that life matters. That for so many years, life has stood up.
But would you all support
Yes,
those
ma'am.
decisions being revisited?
The Supreme Court is a separate branch of government. They take their positions, yes.
If you were Speaker and House Republicans win the majority, what are some of the abortion bills that you would put on the floor?
Well, first and foremost, I believe in saving every life possible. Look at what we have done. Hyde Amendment, but more importantly, look at what the Democrats have done. For decades, that was a bipartisan position. Why did this new radical agenda, when the Democrats took the House, the Senate, and the White House, even the President Biden, who had supported that, removed that? You look at Ann Wagner's bill. And when you look at what we can do, we will continue to look wherever we can go to save as many lives as possible.
So you would put Ann Wagner's
yes.
bill on the floor?
Leader, you touched on this a little bit, but current laws are still in place right now where the Attorney General is just not doing anything about it in plain politics. What would you want to tell him specifically?
I would tell him in less than 140 days, things are going to change here. And he will have now a Congress that will call him up. He will now have the ability of a Congress to have oversight. He will now have a Congress that will hold him accountable. Thank you all, and most importantly, to America. I continue to pray, one, for the safety of everyone, but more importantly, we now have a voice for all life. Thank you, and God bless.
And that was House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, Republican of California, at a news conference attended by quite a few other members of his leadership there on House of Representatives, applauding the decision of the Supreme Court earlier today to overturn Roe against Wade and Casey versus Planned Parenthoods, referring to what the Democrats had done for many years as what he called a radical agenda that now is going to be overturned, and also warning the Attorney General to make sure that they protect it against possible violence and demonstrations against what has been done. Saying that in 140 days that there's going to be a new sheriff in town. At least they're going to have, he thinks, a majority in the House, and they will hold Merrick Garland to account. For a summary now of where we are, we turn now to our Washington correspondent, Joe Matthew. He is, of course, the host of Sound On every day of the week at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. He's up at the Supreme Court of the United States. So what is the agenda of the Republicans now? Do they want more legislation on abortion? Is that what we were hearing from Mr. McCarthy?
We didn't get much of an answer on that, at least not in terms of specifics there, David. But interesting, he did talk about the effort to save every life possible and condemned the Democrats for what he called their support for abortion on demand. There could well be continued legislation that comes from what would be a Republican-led House, assuming they take the majority. Our own Greg Storr, the Bloomberg Supreme Court reporter, in fact, was talking about the possibility of legislation that might control women's ability to travel outside of states that ban abortion to those that have legalized it. One of the things he pointed out, interestingly, David, he said pro-life activists are not predicting a night of rage. That's not something that's gotten a lot of coverage, but it's been getting a lot of talk here in the nation's capital, with activists promising what they've called a night of rage or a purge if, in fact, this ruling came down as it did. White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre was asked about that just in the last week or so, and the White House condemned any action of violence or vandalism that might follow this ruling. It's something, David, that law enforcement are keenly aware of as we head into the evening hours here later today in Washington.
And Kevin McCarthy specifically called out the need to make sure we protect the justices themselves, as we have had some threats against them, so even that one individual who got fairly close to one justice's house. At the same time, I was struck by the fact that Mr. McCarthy was asked specifically about things like same-sex marriage and contraception, and he would not touch it with a 10-foot pole, to use a legal phrase.
That's very true, and that's been consistent since the draft first leaked. That has been a refrain that we've heard from Speaker Nancy Pelosi, saying this is just the beginning. This is the opening stage in what could be a much wider crackdown on liberties, as they've pointed to same-sex marriage, to your point, among others. But Kevin McCarthy's been very careful about this. This is a very delicate issue that's going to resonate on the campaign trail, no matter what lawmakers say, and they want to try to channel that energy to their benefit the best they can.
Okay, thank you so much once again to our very own Joe Matthew. He's the host of Sound On every day of the week at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. You're going to want to hear that on Bloomberg Radio. But before that, we'll have Joe back on here. Now let's turn back to our Bloomberg political contributors, Rick Davis and Jeannie Sheehan Zaino. So, Jeannie, I didn't get a chance to ask you actually what Joe was just talking about. Is this going to make a difference on the campaign trail come the midterms, Jeannie?
You know, I think it will. I don't think that something like the import that people place on the economy and inflation is going to be superseded by this. But I do think if this turns out to be a base election, as many midterms are, this could play a role. But I think the role I would watch for is particularly at the state level. You know, in your home state of Michigan, for instance, in states like Pennsylvania, we are looking at gubernatorial races in which an abortion decision like this can play big potentially in those kinds of state and local races. So I would look there first, because to your previous guest point, there's not a lot that the U.S. Congress is going to be able to do at this point to affect this decision. But there is a lot that can be done at the state level. So I think this is where the battle is going to play out as it pertains to the midterm.
So, Rick, what's the danger of the Republicans overplaying their hand?
You know, look, I mean, I think you look at some of the numbers and, you know, the vast majority of the United States voters, 60% plus, did not want to see Roe overturned. But then when you drill down and you start talking about things like what Kevin McCarthy was just talking about, which is support for third trimester abortion, all that vanishes. So you're seeing a polarization right now in people's rhetoric. Democrats want to make this about not just abortion, but every other civil liberty that's been adjudicated by the court in the last 20 years. And Republicans want to make it all about the worst case scenario within an abortion and not even talk about any of that stuff. So Republicans have the potential of being drawn into a larger culture war. They're pretty experienced at this kind of stuff, and the last thing I want to do is play off of the field of play that the Democrats paint.
And Rick, what about the question of things like same-sex marriage and contraception? Is that a bridge too far for Republicans, or might some Republicans want to take that on as well?
Well, I think that there's a short-term and a long-term point of view on those. Short-term, no one's going to want to talk about that stuff between now and November on the Republican side, because they've already got those voters, and there's nothing they can actually tangibly do about it right now. And it would just potentially exacerbate the opposition that is already going to be ginned up by the Roe decision. So that's why you see Kevin McCarthy ducking for cover when asked that question. Long-term, I think you start looking at the demographics of this country and who's voting. And I think you're going to see there's not a lot of popular support to overturn these popular issues. These issues came in with a wave of young voters. That's only increased. The millennial voters, over 90 million of them, look at these issues in a pretty enlightened light. So I think that it's a dangerous path to play, because there is no actual legislative potential there. There aren't anywhere near the votes in the Senate to make significant changes. So they're going to wait and see what the court does with those things.
Jeannie, thinking again about the midterm elections, and then perhaps even your favorite subject, 2024, what about the so-called suburban women?
You know, that's going to be critical because, if you think about 2018, for instance, a very different time, but Democrats did very well in the midterm election, in part because they ran on health care and they were able to attract suburban women in particular. And there's a lot of talk in Democratic circles. Abortion is obviously an issue of health, and it's an issue of concern that Democrats can use in this election. Now, of course, it's a very different time. It's a very bad year for Democrats, and they do have the White House. But if there was anything that could turn the page for Democrats, short of bringing down inflation and fixing the economy, it would be a decision like this. So I do think we're going to hear a lot about it. And I would just say, and I'm sorry if I'm reading here, David, I think we're going to hear a lot from Judge Thomas's concurrence in this. He says, and I quote, "In future cases, we should reconsider the court's substantive due process precedents, including Griswold, Lawrence, and Obergefell." Those are the decisions that the Democrats are going to want to talk a lot about, because to Rick's point, while Republicans are going to want to avoid it, Democrats want to say this is a slippery slope. Contraception, same-sex marriage, the right to do what you want in your own bedroom, those things are next. And I think we're going to hear an awful lot about that in the coming months.
Yeah. So, Rick, we're going to hear a lot about it. At the same time, I really wonder, I've read some things, you would know it far better than I do. Some talk that perhaps the Democrats have taken for granted some of the people of color, particularly the Latino community. And I wonder how the Latino community is likely to respond to this, because there are some within the Latino community who are more conservative, small c conservative, from a social values point of view.
That's right. I had the benefit of working with John McCain for 25 years, and he was one of the top vote getters within the Latino community, both nationally and in the Arizona population. And the reality is Latinos have conservative values. They by and large in the state of Arizona, for instance, are Catholics. They would be a pro-life community in this context. And so Democrats have to tread lightly. I mean, we've polarized our politics on this to the point where there are no pro-choice Republicans anymore, and there used to be a bunch, and there are no pro-life Democrats anymore, and there used to be a lot. So these parties have taken on the patina of this issue, much to their detriment, frankly. And so I do think, certainly in the Hispanic community and those communities of faith that overlap minority communities, are going to be looking at this going, where are they going with this?
Okay, thank you so much to our Bloomberg contributors, Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis, who will be back with us later during this special 2-hour broadcast. Coming up, more on the Supreme Court's decision. We're going to speak with Radhika Rao. She's UC Hastings professor of constitutional law and former clerk to Justices Blackmun as well as Justice Marshall. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. We're going straight to the White House. We're going to join in progress President Biden, who is decrying the decision of the Supreme Court today.
National consensus that most Americans of faith and backgrounds found acceptable, that have been the law of the land for most of the lifetime of Americans today. And it was a constitutional principle upheld by justices appointed by Democrat and Republican presidents alike. Roe v. Wade was a 7-2 decision, written by a justice appointed by a Republican president, Richard Nixon. In the 5 decades that followed Roe v. Wade, justices appointed by Republican presidents from Eisenhower, Nixon, and Reagan, George W. Bush, were among the justices who voted to uphold the principles set forth in Roe v. Wade. It was 3 justices named by one president, Donald Trump, who were the core of today's decision to upend the scales of justice and eliminate a fundamental right for women in this country. Make no mistake, this decision is a culmination of a deliberate effort over decades to upset the balance of our law. It's a realization of an extreme ideology and a tragic error by the Supreme Court, in my view. The court has done what it has never done before, expressly take away a constitutional right that is so fundamental to so many Americans that had already been recognized. The court's decision to do so will have real and immediate consequences. State laws banning abortion are automatically taking effect today, jeopardizing the health of millions of women, some without exceptions. So extreme that women could be punished for protecting their health. So extreme that women and girls were forced to bear their rapist's child. With the child a consequence. It just stuns me. So extreme that doctors will be criminalized for fulfilling their duty to care. Imagine having a young woman have to carry the child of incest as a consequence of incest. No option. Too often the case. The poor women are going to be hit the hardest. It's cruel. In fact, the court laid out state laws criminalizing abortion that go back to the 1800s as rationale. The court literally taking America back 150 years. This is a sad day for the country, in my view. But it doesn't mean the fight's over. Let me be very clear and unambiguous. The only way we can secure a woman's right to choose, and the balance that existed, is for Congress to restore the protections of Roe v. Wade as federal law. No executive action from the president can do that. And if Congress, as it appears, lacks the votes to do that now, voters need to make their voices heard. This fall, we must elect more senators and representatives who will codify women's right to choose into federal law once again. Elect more state leaders to protect this right at the local level. We need to restore the protections of Roe as law of the land. We need to elect officials who will do that. This fall, Roe is on the ballot. Personal freedoms are on the ballot. The right to privacy, liberty, equality, they're all on the ballot. Until then, I will do all of my power to protect a woman's right in states where they will face the consequences of today's decision. While the court's decision cast a dark shadow over a large swath of the land, many states in this country still recognize a woman's right to choose. So, if a woman lives in a state that restricts abortion, the Supreme Court's decision does not prevent her from traveling from her home state to the state that allows it. It does not prevent a doctor in that state from treating her. As the Attorney General has made clear, women must remain free to travel safely to another state to seek care they need. My administration will defend that bedrock right. If any state or local official, high or low, tries to interfere with a woman's exercising her basic right to travel, I will do everything in my power to fight that deeply un-American attack. My administration will also protect a woman's access to medications that are approved by the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, like contraception, which is essential for preventative health care, mifepristone, which the FDA approved 20 years ago to safely end early pregnancies and is commonly used to treat miscarriages. Some states are saying that they'll try to ban or severely restrict access to these medications. But extremist governors and state legislators are looking to block the mail or search a person's medicine cabinet or control a woman's actions by tracking data on her apps she uses are wrong and extreme and out of touch with the majority of Americans. The American Medical Association, the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists wrote to me and Vice President Harris stressing that these laws are not based on evidence and asking us to act to protect access to care. They say by limiting access to these medicines, maternal mortality will climb in America. That's what they say. Today, I'm directing the Department of Health and Human Services to take steps to ensure these critical medications are available to the fullest extent possible. And the politicians cannot interfere in the decisions that should be made between a woman and her doctor. And my administration will remain vigilant as the implications of this decision play out. I've warned about how this decision risks the broader right to privacy for everyone. That's because Roe recognized the fundamental right to privacy that has served as a basis for so many more rights that we've come to take for granted, that are ingrained in the fabric of this country. The right to make the best decisions for your health. The right to use birth control, a married couple in the privacy of their bedroom, for God's sake. The right to marry the person you love. Justice Thomas said as much today. He explicitly called to reconsider the right of marriage equality, the right of couples to make their choices on contraception. This extreme and dangerous path the court is now taking us on. Let me close with 2 points. First, I call on everyone, no matter how deeply they care about this decision, to keep all protests peaceful. Peaceful, peaceful, peaceful. No intimidation. Violence is never acceptable. Threats and intimidation are not speech. We must stand against violence in any form, regardless of your rationale. Second, I know so many of us are frustrated and disillusioned that the court has taken something away that's so fundamental. I know so many women are now going to face incredibly difficult situations. I hear you. I support you. I stand with you. The consequences and the consensus of the American people, core principles of equality, liberty, dignity, and the stability of the rule of law demand that Roe should not have been overturned. With this decision, the conservative majority of the Supreme Court shows how extreme it is, how far removed they are from the majority of this country. They've made the United States an outlier among developed nations in the world. But this decision must not be the final word. My administration will use all of its appropriate lawful powers, but Congress must act. And with your vote, you can act. You can have the final word. This is not over. Thank you very much. More to say this in weeks to come. Thank you.
And we have been listening to and watching President Joe Biden from the White House addressing that decision this morning, the Supreme Court overturning Roe versus Wade, as well as Casey versus Planned Parenthood. He said it was a tragic error by the Supreme Court of the United States, that it was a sad day for the court and for the country as well. But he said it does not mean that the fight is over. He specifically called on Congress to adopt a federal statute with the protection of Roe against Wade, admitting that it is now constituted. Congress would not do that, but therefore he said that the voters must speak and the midterm elections. He also said he would use all his powers with his executive branch to make sure that the right to travel was protected and also the right to receive medication approved by the FDA and contraceptives. So he is certainly very steamed up about it, but he also said, very importantly, any protests need to be peaceful. This is no occasion for intimidation or threats or violence of any sort, responding in a sense to House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy's earlier remarks on that subject. We welcome now, for more on this, Tina Davis. She's Bloomberg News executive editor. So, Tina, I thought it was interesting. He specifically invoked Justice Clarence Thomas's concurring opinion about substantive due process, something that I know you focused on as well.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that's one of the more interesting outcomes of this approach, of this ruling today. So when the draft opinion leaked last month, there was a lot of talk about what it meant for other freedoms, essentially, for gay marriage, as the president mentioned, for contraceptives, for potentially, anti-sodomy laws, striking down those. And the Alito draft opinion said quite clearly, this does not affect those other rights. This is different because it has to do with a human life, and therefore, it doesn't necessarily mean we upend the precedent behind those decisions that have already been made. However, Clarence Thomas issued, as you said, a concurring opinion in which he was alone and saying, look, we need to look at all of these things. And that is actually referenced directly in the dissent from the liberal justices that were against this ruling.
We had the three liberal justices. We also had Justice Kavanaugh joined by Chief Justice Roberts, concurring in the judgment, not in the opinion. And if Clarence Thomas wanted to go farther, both Justice Kavanaugh and the Chief Justice didn't want to go as far.
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting opinion because you get to see a little bit of how the court is shaking out as we see these new justices coming into their own, including Kavanaugh and Barrett. And Gorsuch not so much, but the three justices essentially that were put on the court by Donald Trump, we get to see what role they're playing. I think what's particularly interesting to me is looking at the role that Roberts played. Roberts joined the liberal minority in voting against overturning Roe v. Wade. And that's something that's going to make him, I think, a target for a lot of conservatives who feel like he's not actually that conservative as they thought he was going to be when he took over. He was obviously not appointed by Trump, but he was appointed by Bush prior. But he was an interesting vote, I think, in that this is someone who's tried to lead the court in a very old-fashioned way. He's very much an institutionalist, and the court seems to not necessarily be following him.
Yeah, exactly. We talk about conservatives or liberals. He's sort of for the institution, it appears, in a lot of his decision-making. Thank you so much, Tina. It's great to have you with us. That's Tina Davis of Bloomberg. And now we want to turn to an authority on the court and on constitutional law. She's Radhika Rao. She's UC Hastings professor of constitutional law, and she clerked in the past for Justice Blackmun as well as Justice Marshall. So, Professor, thank you so much for being with us. Let's pick up on just exactly what Tina was talking about, and that is Chief Justice Roberts and his position here, joining in the judgment, not in the opinion, joining the opinion instead of Kavanaugh. What does this decision, do you think, mean about the institution of the Supreme Court?
I think this decision is very revealing, and it's actually, I agree with Biden, it's a dark day for the court and a dark day for the country and for all of the women across the country who are going to be affected. What does this decision mean specifically in terms of Roberts' opinion? He does say that he would have taken a more measured course and he would only uphold this law, but not overturn Roe. He essentially wants to bide his time and to wait until it's necessary before overturning Roe. But he's not really saying that he thinks that, that there is a constitutional right to an abortion, only that the court should issue a more narrow ruling at this point.
So, Professor, I'm curious about one thing. As a scholar of the Supreme Court, I ask you this. Roe v. Wade was on the books for about 50 years or so. It strikes me that the country did not come together to support it. It feels as divided today as it was the day it was decided. Does that tell us something about the decision, bearing in mind that you did clerk for Justice Blackmun, the author of Roe against Wade?
Yes, I do think that the decision is divisive, but I actually think the court, Justice Alito's opinion in Dobbs, purports to suggest that overturning Roe is going to bring the country together. I think it's going to have exactly the opposite impact. We are already seeing the fallout of what you might call the interjurisdictional abortion wars, where the red states are getting redder and the blue states are getting bluer. In the red states, they're trying to prohibit abortion, not only within the state, but really to limit the ability of women to travel to other states to seek abortion. And in the blue states, we're seeing the attempt to immunize against prosecution their physicians who prescribe abortion medications for those in other states. So really, this decision is leading us to even greater polarization, even greater division.
Professor, let's pick up on that because we just heard from President Biden saying that he's going to use the full force of his office to make sure that you can't interfere, for example, with travel, interstate travel for the purpose of abortion. Does that raise further constitutional issues if a state does try to impede that?
It does. It definitely raises issues about the constitutional right to travel. And one of the good things about this opinion is Justice Kavanaugh, in his concurring opinion, suggested that he thought that there was, in fact, a constitutional right to travel. Some of those constitutional right to travel precedents, however, are a little bit murky, and they really haven't been invoked. So the problem will be how many justices will actually sign on ultimately to a constitutional right to travel. Right. When the issue comes before the court.
Okay, Professor, really great to have you on today. Thank you very much for being here. It's Radhika Rao of UC Hastings Law School. I want you to check out the Balance of Power newsletter on the terminal and online. Coming up, we're going to stay on the air for a second hour of coverage on Balance of Power on both TV and radio. The special coverage of the Supreme Court decision overturning Roe v. Wade, as well as Casey versus Planned Parenthood. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.
From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power with David Westin.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our television and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to our second hour of Balance of Power as we continue coverage of the Supreme Court's overturning of the Roe v. Wade abortion rights ruling. And first, we want to go to the place where it all began at 10:10 Eastern Time this morning, the Supreme Court of the United States itself, when they handed down that momentous decision in the Dunn case, overturning both Roe against Wade and Casey versus Planned Parenthood. We go to our man on the scene. He's Washington correspondent Joe Matthew. He is, of course, the host of Sound On and joins us from outside the Supreme Court. So Joe, I want to start actually with an important point we were talking about before, which is we're hearing a lot from people who are very upset about this decision. I understand why they are. We can sort of overlook the fact that there are a fair number of people who like it. Let's start actually by going back to what Kevin McCarthy, the House Minority Leader, said earlier today. This is where
the voiceless will finally have a voice. This great nation can now live up to its core principle that all are created equal, not born equal, created equal.
So, Joe, we listened to that together, and we really have to bear in mind there are a lot of voters out there who feel pretty good about this decision in all likelihood.
Oh, absolutely. And they're represented in the crowd behind me, David. There's been a lot of chanting, a lot of yelling, and a lot of singing over the last couple of hours in front of the Supreme Court. But you're right. Over the past hour, we have heard both sides of this issue presented by both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue. Kevin McCarthy there, widely believed to be the next Speaker of the House if Republicans take the majority, delivering the lines that you just played for us, while President Biden called this a sad day for the court and a sad day for America. Remarkable as well to hear President Biden call out the former president by name, saying it was 3 justices named by one president, Donald Trump, who are at the core of this decision. The president also calling for calm, as there have been threats of violence and vandalism tonight, a night of rage, as some activists have called it. The White House has been consistent, though, David, over the past couple of days that they will not tolerate violence. And law enforcement here in the nation's capital, they say they are prepared. There's a massive fence, a massive barrier that's been set up around the Supreme Court since that first draft opinion leaked. That was many weeks ago. It's still there, although we have seen a very wide police presence since 10 o'clock this morning, David.
Yeah, and it looks, at least from the video, it looks like it's a fairly tame, fairly organized grouping there. Thank you so much to Bloomberg's Joe Matthew. He's host of Sound On. You want to catch that this afternoon at 5 p.m. Eastern Time on Bloomberg Radio. And now we go to Bloomberg Supreme Court reporter Greg Stohr. Greg, you heard what the president had to say, saying this basically has never happened before in history, the Supreme Court taking away a fundamental right. Is he right?
More or less, yes. Certainly no right as consequential as this, a right that transformed the lives of millions of women and sparked this decades-long movement to overturn it. It is unquestionably a historic day.
Okay, and as a practical matter, what kind of divisions are there on the court from this? Because it was not really a 6-3 decision; it was 5-1-3, right? There was 2-3.
Well, at least Chief Justice John Roberts is the one who said, I would uphold this Mississippi law that bans abortion after 15 weeks, but I wouldn't go so far as to overturn Roe. And in fact, he suggested that he might actually have upheld a much narrower right to terminate a pregnancy, at least earlier in pregnancy. There's also a key opinion by Justice Brett Kavanaugh. He concurred, he joined the majority opinion, voted to overturn Roe. But he also said, for example, that he would not vote to uphold a state that tried to restrict travel by somebody to a state where abortion is allowed. He also said he would not support retroactive punishment for people who had abortions. So he's probably a pivotal vote going forward as we battle over future restrictions.
Okay, Greg, thank you so much for all your coverage today, which is not done yet, I suspect. It's Greg Stohr. He's Bloomberg Supreme Court reporter. Joining us now is Donald Ayer. He's former Principal Deputy Solicitor General in the Reagan administration and was Deputy Attorney General in the administration of George Herbert Walker Bush. He's now an adjunct professor at Georgetown Law. So, Don, thank you so much for being with us. If you'll indulge me here, I want to play something that we just heard from President Biden, where he said that basically this is unprecedented what the Supreme Court's done. This is what President Biden just had to say.
Today, the Supreme Court of the United States expressly took away a constitutional right from the American people that it had already recognized. They didn't limit it, they simply took it away. That's never been done to a right so important to so many Americans. But they did it. It's a sad day for the court and for the country.
So, Don, talk about this just as a matter of Supreme Court history and precedent. Obviously, overturning an important precedent of some 50 years is a big deal. It's not the first time the Supreme Court has ever done that. They did it in Brown against Board of Education. But is this the first time they did it in a way that took away a fundamental right?
I believe it is, yeah. And if you think in terms of our Bill of Rights and other ways that people's rights to engage in certain kinds of behavior or conduct, this is the first instance, I believe, where the court has simply said, and here after 49 or so years, there was a constitutional right recognized that existed, and we're taking it away.
One of the things that I've been asked today, at least, is how could they do this when a majority of Americans, according to polls at least, do not favor taking away this right? It's something like, 60-65% say that there should be some right of abortion of some form. But on the other hand, Don, the Supreme Court's not there to reflect the will of the majority of the people on a given day, right?
Well, that's right. And I don't think anybody thinks that they should be there to purely reflect the will of the majority. But one of the important things that's occurred pretty graphically in the last 2 days with the gun case decided yesterday and the leaked opinion in Dobbs having come out, a couple months ago. The court has now made clear that they have a vision of their own omniscience in terms of what the founders meant to do and a sense of sort of an absolutist view of what the Constitution means. They've specifically said in this opinion and something pretty similar in the opinion yesterday that they're not going to be influenced by thinking about consequences in the form of how people will react or in the context of the gun case yesterday, consequences in the sense of weighing what's going to happen if a certain regulation is invalidated. They appear to be ready to simply go off and follow their sense of what the founders wanted and just implement it and not really pay attention to where that may take the country.
I wonder where we're going next. I mean, it's impossible to know, but we can certainly speculate about it because there's a lot of talk about how far this decision may reach into things like contraception and same-sex marriage. And we do have a concurring opinion from Justice Thomas, basically saying, yeah, those are on the list now. We're going to take a hard look at that. Do we have any sense of how far the ramifications of this opinion may go?
I don't think we do. And I wouldn't predict that that's going to happen, even though it's pretty clear that Justice Thomas, it's very clear from his opinion that he would go there. I think what is more ominous even than that is something that isn't really being very much talked about it, but this same court has a vision of certain other rights which it is ready to expand. It has expanded certain forms of First Amendment speech rights. It's expanded free exercise rights under the First Amendment. It's expanded the takings clause. It's expanded a bunch of rights based on its sort of vision and sense of, I guess, the founders' intention. I don't really know. But in a way that has a common theme. And that common theme is to impair and undermine the functioning of government. One good example of that are the cases it decided that invalidated local government restrictions for COVID safety purposes. But there's a lot more, and there's a case coming up in the next day or two that's dealing with the Clean Air Act. And the court is pretty likely to take a narrow textualist reading of that statute, which may well lead us to a very narrow reading of the Clean Air Act, and again, impairing the function of government, which I think is going to be the dominant theme of their upcoming jurisprudence.
Don, you have a lot of experience in Washington, a lot of experience in the Justice Department, and specifically, I'd like to draw upon your experience in the Solicitor General's office. The Solicitor General, of course, represents the United States in the Supreme Court. You've spent a lot of time in that court. You've argued cases. You know how it works. Is this going to generate a lot more litigation? Because already we're talking about things like maybe states restricting travel outside the state or restricting doctors, things like that. Could we have a lot of abortion litigation following on from this?
I think it's possible, but I don't think you know to what degree the Supreme Court is going to participate in that. I think, the bigger concern that I have is that the court, this 5-member, majority, now seems to be ready to act in what I would have to characterize as pretty extreme ways, if yesterday and today are any indication. And I think that's going to invite a sea of litigation from people rubbing their hands together saying, aha, we have a court that will take our case on X issue because they're in sync with us. And I think you're going to see a lot more of that kind of litigation. And it worries me because I don't know what the limits of this court are going to be. And if they're not, if what's happened so far is bad enough that it's going to undermine trust by a lot of people. And if they keep it up, it's going to get worse and worse.
Okay, Don, thank you so much for being with us. Appreciate it. That's Donald Ayer, a true veteran of the Justice Department and now an adjunct professor at Georgetown Law. Coming up, Barbara Perry, professor and director of presidential studies at University of Virginia's Miller Center, is going to join us. This is a special edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is a special edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. We are really focused today on the Supreme Court decision overturning Roe against Wade as well as Casey versus Planned Parenthood. But I must say, I hadn't been paying attention to the markets, and they are up. For our Bloomberg audience, you should know equity markets are all up over 2% right now. So continuing that little rally, whether it's a bear market rally or not. In the meantime, let's turn back to that decision. One of the important questions is how this decision, an historic decision, everyone agrees, fits into the history of the Supreme Court and what it does to it as an institution. For some answers on that, we go now to Barbara Perry. She's professor and director of presidential studies at University of Virginia's Miller Center. She has served as a U.S. Supreme Court fellow and has worked for both Republican and Democratic members of the Senate. So, Barbara, thank you so much for being with us. Put this in historical context. How does it fit?
I've been studying the history of the court and the Constitution for over 4 decades now. And I can't remember a case that had such impact across such a broad swath of the American people. So I think that's the first thing to note. It depending on what side a person's on, it doesn't really matter in this sense. These are matters of life and death, literally. So I think we have to focus on that and then say, what is the impact on the court? And that is that when it wades into these issues, no pun intended on Roe v. Wade, but when it wades into these issues of life and death, it means that it's going to generate a lot of emotion on both sides.
So one of the things that we've heard said, including by the President of the United States, that this has never been done before, that the Supreme Court has taken back a fundamental right. At the same time, one of the criticisms is it was a 50-year precedent, and we do have stare decisis, and we respect that, at least try to whenever we can. But I wonder, is that right? I mean, Brown versus Board of Education didn't take away a right, it gave a right, but it overturned a much older precedent, did it not?
It did. It overturned one that was some 50 some odd years old, going all the way back to 1896 in the Plessy versus Ferguson case, which allowed for public segregation in that case of transportation, trains in particular. So yes, we do have overturning of precedent on occasion. Usually people think in terms of progress being made when something is overturned. It also means that time marches on, things change in society, despite the fact that justices in this majority talk about being originalists and going back to the founders' intentions as they wrote the Constitution and the amendments that have come since then. But times do change, and sometimes the court keeps up with the times, and sometimes it does not.
Barbara, it strikes me that in Roe against Wade back in 1973, the court generated a lot of controversy in the country, but for itself as well, a controversy that really didn't die down much that I could tell over some 50 years. At the same time, the court is right back into the controversy now. What does that do to it as an institution in its credibility with the populace?
I've been thinking along those same lines, David, certainly all day. And it is the case that Justice Scalia on the conservative side used to say, oh, ever since Roe v. Wade, we've been inundated with mail, and every anniversary in January of Roe v. Wade, thousands of pro-life marchers come and march around the court. So wouldn't it be great if we could put this aside in some fashion? In his case, it would have been to overturn Roe v. Wade. But we see in their picture here on screen that there are people out in front of the court, and it's very unusual to see those kinds of fences around the court. So I think, again, it shows the kind of emotion. The notion of precedent that you mentioned previously, the reason courts have tended to want to hold on to precedent is that we don't want fundamental law to be changing every day or even every 50 years. It puts uncertainty into the law. So I think part and parcel of this, along with the leak of this opinion a couple of months ago, has led to the low approval ratings for the court. It's down around the 40% range and might go lower because a majority of Americans do support a right to access to abortion, at least in the early stages of pregnancy.
Barbara, what does this decision do to the leadership of the Chief Justice? You talk about approval ratings. I'm not sure where his are right now, but he's sort of in the middle, joining in the judgment, not in the opinion. Clearly, he's an institutionalist, but is he really leading this court at this point? Or, to be blunt with you, is Clarence Thomas?
I think Clarence Thomas and Justice Alito are leading the court now, and I think that Chief Justice Roberts, who when he first came on the bench in 2005 said that he would hope to engage in a number of decisions and lead decisions that would, if not be unanimous, at least be 6-7 or even 8-1. He's not seeing that now. And so I think it also shows you how far to the right the court has moved, given that he's now viewed as a centrist. Your old boss, Justice Lewis Powell, a great justice, I admire him so much, was viewed as the swing justice, and he truly was a moderate. He tended to be in the middle between conservatives and liberals. But it shows you how far the court has moved to the right, given that the Chief Justice is now viewed as being in the center, but he doesn't have control of that center as Justice Powell did.
Well, that's nice of you to say that about Justice Powell. I certainly agree. He was a wonderful man, a great justice, in my opinion. Finally, though, I wonder also, the Supreme Court doesn't issue decisions for popularity. At the same time, if it issues a controversial decision and it doesn't get the country to get behind it sooner or later, does it have a problem? Brown versus Board of Education, 50 years afterwards, not too many people were saying it was a mistake. I'm not sure that you can say that about Roe versus Wade.
I don't think so. Again, it's a majority that shows maybe this will mold public opinion in a different way, but I tend to doubt it. Another example of this that didn't really involve life versus death, but the famous or infamous, depending on one's viewpoint, 1962 decision that banned publicly written laws that required prayer in public school, and the prayer would be written by the state, in that case, New York. And that was hardly ever followed in public schools, particularly in the Bible Belt in those days. So sometimes the court has been ignored. In this instance, it obviously has more of an impact on people's very lives.
Okay, Barbara, it's always a treat to get to talk to you, and particularly on something as important as this decision. That's Barbara Perry. She's professor and director of presidential studies at University of Virginia's Miller Center. Coming up, more coverage of the U.S. Supreme Court overturning that historic abortion ruling. This is special edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. We're continuing now with our special coverage of that Supreme Court decision today overturning Roe versus Wade. And we are joined once again by Tina Davis, our Bloomberg legal executive editor. So welcome back, Tina. Good to have you back. So we've heard now from President Biden. We actually interviewed Senator Smith, Tina Smith from Minnesota, about the possibility of a federal congressional statute. People don't think that's going to happen with this Congress. What else could happen in response to this? The question is, what's the next shoe to drop, particularly for those who are trying to preserve some right to an abortion?
Right. Well, aside from federal options, this battle basically now moves to the states, to the individual states. We've already seen the ACLU and Planned Parenthood talking about lawsuits. I believe one is already filed in Michigan. They're talking about a lawsuit in Ohio. What they're doing there is they're challenging any laws that may ban abortion as a result of this ruling. As you well know, David, when the Supreme Court issues these things, they have to also issue the judgments. That paperwork sometimes takes a while, so they're trying to take advantage of the lag time between this opinion and when it gets codified into essentially statute to basically say we want to make sure that individual states still have this power. Some states like New York are moving to put this in the Constitution and other efforts, but in Michigan, we've seen an attorney general there who's been quite clear that she's not going to go forward with the laws that are on the books that would force her to make abortion illegal as a result of this ruling.
Which may lead to a further division between the so-called red and the so-called blue states. We may have two very different United States of America existing side by side when it comes to abortion.
Well, and even more than that, I mean, you've seen in Louisiana, which has been very vocal about, their trigger laws that come into effect. The district attorney of New Orleans has said that he's not going to enforce that law in the city. So, it's not only a red versus blue state. It could, be as much as, what block you live on in terms of whether or not the law enforcement agencies are going to move forward with the laws as written.
So we have some possible workarounds at the state level in terms of governments, but also we're getting the private sector reacting. A number of companies now have come out and said what they're going to do in response.
Yeah, we've had a few companies today that have responded. There have been companies previously, certainly when the Texas law came into effect, we saw some companies that were very vocal. Uber and Citibank, I believe, both said, look, we're going to offer our employees the ability, some support and some money if they need to travel out of state for this kind of health care, that we will do that. Today we had JP Morgan saying that. We've had CVS and a few other companies that are basically saying it's in our best interest to make sure that our employees have access to all the health care they need, and they're looking to even out any inequities based on where an employee is based.
Yeah, of course, that leaves out people who aren't fortunate enough to work at JP Morgan, or I think Meta has done that. Disney said something as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be, I think, the larger companies, the companies that obviously can afford to take on this extra amount of cost. But, in an era like we have now where, the unemployment is so low and there is such a battle for the workforce, this might be another thing that you could use to try to make yourself attractive to a worker.
Yes, thank you so much for all your work on this today, which is not finished, I'm afraid, Tina. That's Tina Davis of Bloomberg. Coming up, we're going to talk with Lawrence Tribe, professor of constitutional law at Harvard Law School and considered one of the nation's leading constitutional scholars. That's coming up next. This is a special edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is a special edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. It's high time we got to check on the markets because we have a nice rally going in equities, and Abigail Doolittle is here to tell us all about it.
A very nice rally indeed, David. On the day, we have the major indexes up more than 2%. That S&P 500 right now near session highs up 2.4%. The tech-heavy NASDAQ up about an equal amount, up 2.5%. Perhaps the bigger picture is on the week, we have the S&P 500 up about 6%, the first up week in 4, the best week since the end of May. Of course, the big question is what's behind this rally? I would argue it has to do with the fact that investors are digesting the FOMC decision from last week, that it's this Goldilocks tightening. We also have this Goldilocks balance right now between inflation and a recession, along with data. The fact that data isn't too strong, but it's not too bad either, puts us right in that scenario as well. So a bit of a Goldilocks scenario here. The question is it a bear market rally or is it the start of a bounce? I stick with the bear market rally, but I feel like this one, I said this the other day, I feel like this one could be pretty convincing. It may not just be a week or two. It could actually be a little bit longer.
You did say that. I'll agree with that. That's exactly right. Thank you so much to Abigail Doolittle for that report on the markets. In the meantime, we want to continue that story of that Supreme Court decision that came down at 10:10 Eastern Time today. Go back up to the Supreme Court itself, where we have Joe Matthews, Washington correspondent and host of Sound On every day of the week on Bloomberg Radio. So, Joe, first of all, just bring us up to date on the demonstration or the gathering up there. What are you seeing?
This crowd has been hanging around for a couple of hours now, David. It was a little bit bigger in the moments after the ruling was announced, and we saw lines of people streaming up to Capitol Hill and to the Supreme Court behind me. But I'll tell you, those who remain are very vocal. There are signs that I could not read on the air, this being a family program. There are also chants that might be familiar from events like these: no justice, no peace. We've heard music playing, we've heard songs singing. And this represents both sides. We need to be clear. There are pro-choice and pro-life activists who have gathered outside the Supreme Court in the hundreds and even thousands at various points of the day. And of course, that brings about the issue of security. Capitol Police have really lined themselves up around this whole area between the Supreme Court and the U.S. Capitol. And we know that the justices are being protected at their homes as well. It was just last week the president signed into law this legislation that gives justices' families the opportunity to enjoy the same protection if the marshal of the Supreme Court suggested. And that's exactly what we have seen since the attempt on Justice Kavanaugh's life, or at least the arrest, believing that was the case up in Maryland. So things have been, I won't use the word calm, but certainly secure so far, David.
So Joe, I'm going to throw you a curveball, but it's one you can certainly hit out of the park, because as you were talking, we got word that the House has now passed that bipartisan gun safety bill, and it's headed to the president's desk. I mean, there's so much news coming out of Washington right now. That's not a big surprise, but it is a big development.
Well, that's true. As a matter of fact, the Senate got this done in very quick time. The vote last night to pass this on a bipartisan level, and it was expected that the House would follow. But, you know, we're talking about this ruling being significant over the last 50 years of history, and this legislation is significant over the last 30 years of history. There have been a number of attempts following mass shootings in this country, but never until we've seen this following the shootings in Uvalde and Buffalo have we seen something come together into legislation with bipartisan support that actually got to the floor and passed. Remembering that John Cornyn, the Republican from Texas, and Mitch McConnell himself, the minority leader in the Senate, signed off on these talks. They got things together with Democrats, and here we are with an incentive for states to pass red flag laws and expanded background checks for people under 21. The president's expected to sign that imminently, David.
A whole lot of history being made down in Washington right now. Thank you so much to Bloomberg's Joe Matthew, host of Sound On. You can listen to him tonight at 5 p.m. Eastern Time on Bloomberg Radio. I want to turn back to that decision of the Supreme Court and bring in one of the true constitutional law experts of his generation, Lawrence Tribe. He's professor of constitutional law at Harvard. He's a leading constitutional scholar who has argued 35 cases in the U.S. Supreme Court during his career, and I will say is the author of the definitive text on the subject. So, Professor Tribe, thank you so much for being with us. Let me start with maybe the most basic, but for me, maybe one of the more important questions. A lot of people today who disagree with this decision say it's unprincipled. It may be wrong, it may be mistaken, but is it unprincipled?
It strikes me as profoundly unprincipled, because the Supreme Court has long said that decisions of great durability, on the basis of which people have reshaped their lives, should not be overruled in the absence of some extraordinary change other than the mere personnel of the court. Nothing has happened other than essentially the Trump packing of the court, the addition of 3 justices selected by Donald Trump. Nothing has changed since Roe v. Wade and Casey to justify suddenly, and for the first time in the court's history, taking away a fundamental personal right. Now, I say it's unprincipled, and I think I would feel that way even if I were strongly pro-choice, because this decision does not simply overturn the right to abortion. It overturns people's control over their own bodies. In the Casey decision in 1992, in a very much overlooked passage, the court said that if we tell women that we can force them to remain pregnant, then it follows we might be able to force some women to have abortions. If, for example, for eugenic reasons, we think that the babies to whom they will give birth are not going to live very long or will live severely crippled lives, or if we think they made an unwise decision in becoming pregnant at a very young age and their parents want them to abort, we can force abortions on them. I wrote an article in The Atlantic just a few weeks ago saying, don't be mistaken. Don't think just because you might be pro-choice and anti-abortion that this decision is definitely going to protect your freedom. This decision takes power away from people over their own bodies and lives and intimate choices and gives that power to government. That's the basic thing it does. And the principle of an anti-tyrannical constitution, that principle is one that is now being shaken by the Supreme Court without any real justification. That's why I call it unprincipled.
If I can ask it this way, what went wrong? It's been on the books for almost 50 years now, Roe versus Wade has. And with other major changes in constitutional law, such as, for example, Brown versus Board of Education, I dare say the country came toward the decision, even if it wasn't there at the beginning. The country didn't come toward this decision. We seem as divided today as we were then. What went wrong?
Well, I think Democrats were not as effective at the political game as Republicans were. They've played a long game, half a century long, gradually putting on the courts people who were committed to a certain view on particular substantive issues: guns, abortion, school prayer, a number of substantive issues. And gradually they did it. And those of us who kept telling Democrats in our own party, you've got to put more emphasis on the importance of electing people who share your constitutional values and will not confirm justices to the Supreme Court who have a completely different view of the Constitution. People didn't listen. We didn't work as hard as the other side did. And, you know, it's a cliche that elections have consequences, but they do. And it was the election of 2016 more than anything else that had this consequence, because when Trump was elected, he told everybody what he's going to do. He was going to put justices on the court who would, he was confident, vote to overrule Roe v. Wade. He did exactly that. And it was the election of Donald Trump that did this. You know, we could go back and find other causes, but this is a direct political consequence. And it's a consequence that really represents the tyranny of the minority, because it is a minority of the people who elected Donald Trump. The justices who made this difference, the three, were all confirmed by a group of senators who were elected by a dramatic minority of the American people. The maldistribution of votes in the Senate is part of the, it's sort of hardwired into our system. But when you add it all up, this is the consequence of a purely political shift, not a shift in understanding of basic rights or anything of the sort.
Professor, you are, of course, a scholar, but you're also, you've spent a career as a strategist, if I can put it that way, of the Supreme Court and doing oral arguments, planning oral arguments. We now have a concurring opinion from Justice Thomas talking about substantive due process rights going well beyond abortion, involving things like contraception, things like same-sex marriage. If you were planning the defense of those, despite the way that this decision came out, what would you do?
Well, I would perhaps consider a different career. But being serious, I think we have to make political changes. I don't think there is any path in the current court. I think Thomas was admirably candid, more so than Alito, Alito pretends that those other rights, like the right to contraception, the right to same-sex marriage, the right to personal intimacy with the person of your choice in the privacy of your home, he pretends that those are not on the chopping block. Well, they are. And Thomas made it very explicit. He's basically inviting challenges. The court cannot prevent the elimination of a fundamental pillar of its jurisprudence from having fallout consequences. And those fallout consequences are very serious, and they can be changed only at the ballot box. If we get a Congress and a Senate that is willing, for example, to consider expanding the court by adding 4 seats, that's a possibility. Even short of that, Congress could pass, if we had a very different Senate, Congress could pass a national codification of the right of personal reproductive choice. The House has already passed such a bill. The current Senate wouldn't even consider debating it. But if we are serious, as the president just said a few minutes ago, that Roe is on the ballot this November, that's where I would put my energy. I would not put my energy at clever brief writing, because that's not going to make the key difference.
Professor, finally, I know, have real respect for the institution of the Supreme Court, as do I. What does this do potentially to the institution itself? And we talk about stare decisis, not because we just want people to stay with what they've said in the past, but also, as I understand it, it's cabined the extraordinary powers of this non-elected branch of government. Are we substantially undermining stare decisis with this decision?
I think without any doubt, the justices talk a good game when they say that we believe in the power of precedent, but when push comes to shove and the rubber hits the road, precedent takes the hindmost. It seems to me that the latest poll, which showed that the court's respect as an institution has fallen to 25%, the lowest in American history, I bet after today it'll be dropping to 15%. I think that's a shame, because I think although the court throughout the course of our history has had more power than I think it's appropriate for an anti-majoritarian body to have, and apart from the brief period of the Warren Court, the court really hasn't protected voting rights or minorities in the way that the myth would have it. Nonetheless, it's important to have an institution that can stand up against tyranny in a way that this court can. And when that institution itself loses respect because it is so obviously being driven by a change in personnel, then I think the country is in danger. And that danger is compounded by the kind of danger we saw in the nearly successful coup and the insurrection of January 6th. So the country is really at the cliff's edge with all of its institutions in a very fragile condition.
Okay, Professor, thank you so much. Really a treat to have you with us today. That is Lawrence Tribe. He's professor of constitutional law at Harvard. Coming up, Doug Heye, former communications director of the Republican National Committee, weighs in on this important decision. This is a special edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. We have special coverage for 2 hours today of that new decision for the Supreme Court out this morning, overturning Roe against Wade, with a lot of consequences for a lot of people, for the economy, for women, and yes, for politics as well. To give us a sense from the Republican point of view, we welcome now Doug Heye. He's a Republican strategist and former RNC communications director. Mr. Heye also served as deputy chief of staff for Eric Cantor when Mr. Cantor was the House Majority Leader. So welcome. It's great to have you here, Doug. We heard earlier from the current minority leader, Kevin McCarthy, with his initial take on what this meant for Republicans. He seems to think it means something pretty good. What do you think?
Yeah, for most Republicans, it means delivering on a promise that has been long held. You know, I used to work in the Senate for Senator Richard Burr, and when I did, he met with then nominee Roberts, then nominee Alito, and when we're going through that process, I wouldn't have told you in 2005, 2006, that's what we would experience, you know, so many years later. This is the culmination for Republicans of what they've campaigned on. And I think if we do political winners and losers here, after 2 weeks of Donald Trump frankly getting his head kicked in by the January 6th committee, he's now able to go to his base and say, I've delivered for you. And that'll be a big message for him if he decides to, run or not run or whatever he decides to do. It cements a big part of his legacy.
Is it going to make any difference really in the midterms?
It will in some ways, but I would tell you, beware people on television saying that whatever happens in politics is great news for their side. It is wishful thinking with sometimes the intellectual honesty of a professional wrestling referee. What we know is that this is going to be an important issue to a lot of voters, but we don't know how much it really ranks on the issues of what they're looking at. So when we talk about moving from banning abortion in theory to in practice, what does that do 4 months from now as people are still paying crazy bills for gas, food, everything that they're spending money on, and where do they rank those issues? So what I'd do is I'd look at specific races where you might have an impact. I'd start in Missouri with the Senate primary, where Eric Greitens was just endorsed by Right to Life, but Eric Schmidt, the Attorney General in Missouri, has already put out a picture of him signing in the trigger laws now. So he's basically saying, well, you might have gotten the endorsement. I'm actually getting things done. So that'll have an important hold on that Senate race. I'd look at governor's races as well, Pennsylvania and Georgia being a good example. And the Pennsylvania Senate race, John Fetterman was out with a statement. We haven't seen him in a long time, but he put a statement out immediately.
Doug, one of the questions I always have when something this dramatic happens is, what's the danger of overplaying it? From either side, I could say. Republicans going too far and perhaps alienating, for example, suburban women. On the other hand, maybe Democrats going too far and maybe alienating particularly some of the Latino population.
Yeah, overreach is always a problem in politics, or a potential problem to be concerned of. I think it's one of the reasons potentially that Mitch McConnell was so keen on getting the gun deal done. And he had said, we have a problem with suburban voters. This is one way that they can go and address this, especially with today's news. But clearly, there's going to be a lot of money raised on this. There's going to be a lot of voter enthusiasm that's impacted by this. What we don't know is Democrats will be more excited, Republicans will be more excited, at least some, and what impact that has. But as these laws are being enacted in state after state, there is a real risk of political backlash, especially as we're now talking about, things like the Obergefell decision and Griswold, of where real issues of privacy, further can be drawn into this.
Yeah, which takes us to the Clarence Thomas, the concurring opinion. Thank you so much, Doug. It's really always a treat to have you with us. That's Doug Heye. He's Republican strategist and former RNC communications director. Coming up, we're going to have some more coverage of that Supreme Court decision. This is a special edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. We're just wrapping up 2 hours of special coverage of that Supreme Court decision from this morning, 10 o'clock Eastern Time, overturning Roe versus Wade. And to wrap it up with us, we go once again to our Washington correspondent, Joe Matthew, up at the Supreme Court. He, of course, is the host of Sound On. He's outside the Supreme Court right now. I hope by 5 p.m. this evening you're going to be back in the radio studio with your program, Joe. So tell us what's going on right now at the Supreme Court.
Yeah. It's getting pretty loud again, I have to admit, David. We saw a little bit of a lull in the crowd for a while there after they had been demonstrating on both sides for the better part of a couple of hours. But AOC showed up. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was here at a rally pro-choice supporters a short time ago, and people really keyed off of that. Just as that was happening, a couple more busloads of Capitol Police showed up. Just off the camera to the side here, there is a very large group of them, all wearing reflector vests. It looks like there are almost as many police as protesters from this angle, to be honest, and they're staying off to the side, presumably in case any kind of aggressive activity breaks out here. There are police as well scattered throughout the crowd, but we now have a very large number of officers just off to the side here on the lawn between the Supreme Court and the U.S. Capitol. This could be a long day. We have no idea how long these protesters are going to be there, David, reminding everyone that hundreds were there even before the ruling was announced this morning at 10 a.m. Washington time.
So, Joe, let me ask you, have you seen any arrests at this point? Because the pictures we're seeing right now look pretty peaceful.
It has been peaceful. It's important to note that. Things get loud. There's been screaming. There's been some crying. There's been laughing and singing. But people have responded to the police fairly well. Every moment I have seen a police officer try to take someone off a bench, off a wall, tell them to calm down, they've actually been accommodating, and hopefully it stays that way. There are concerns about what happens after nightfall tonight, David, and I suspect that's why police are beginning to gather here in the second half of the day.
Joe, we've had a lot of drama today, and you've really covered it magnificently, I must say. You got a long way to go. We're going to have a lot of follow-on in the coming days, weeks, and months, I dare say. At the same time, to remind us, there's one story that is still out there we don't know the end to, and that's the investigation of the leak. It turns out that leaked opinion was basically the opinion we got, so it was right.
That is correct, and it's still unknown even if this was a clerk, if it came from a liberal or a conservative justice. The court has been remarkably tight about this, quiet about this, keeping leaks from getting into the mainstream media here. And look, David, you spent time in this organization. This is a very tightly knit group. After that leak, they circled the wagons, and they are trying to take care of this with the direction of the marshal on their own here. And at some point, presumably, the Chief Justice will tell us what they found. But that is absolutely right. As justices, in many cases, hunker down in their homes with their families with federal protection here in the District of Columbia, in Virginia, and Maryland, there is a very important investigation happening inside that building.
Joe, I can't thank you enough for all your great work through these last 2 hours. That's Bloomberg's Joe Matthew, host of Sound On. You want to listen to that at 5 p.m. this afternoon. And this is Bloomberg with special coverage of the Supreme Court.